Hey everybody, my name is Matt Yocum. I'm back here again today with Pro Sound Effects, so thank you very much to them for having me back. I appreciate it. Today's topic, I'm going to be talking about effects editing organization within a template. Personally speaking, I'm going to be coming at it from, like the approach of a film type effects editor workflow. But a lot of these rules are going to apply in general over different kinds of media, even if you're not working in the same type of template, or if you're working on something that's more commercial versus TV or other types of media. Some of these rules of thumb are going to help you stay organized and stay efficient, and also help your supervisor and mixer if you don't also happen to be that person. So let's just dive into it. Okay, so we're in here inside of my template that I have built out for myself for film workflows, and we're going to be talking about the effects organization specifically. And before we get going, a couple of things that you want to keep in mind when we're talking about effects editing in general and organization is if you are not the supervisor on a show, if you just come on to an editor, 99% of the time, the supervisor is going to provide you with a template that they would like you to cut in. And it's always good to ask some opening questions about that supervisor's preferences, because more than likely that supervisor has also talked to whoever might be mixing the show in the future. And that mixer might have specific preferences. So your supervisor and your mixer are probably in communication about the way they want things to work. And so they're gonna already have preferences in mind. If you happen to be the supervisor or the mixer, then perhaps these are some good things to keep in mind for yourself for improving efficiency and speed and just overall organization for ease of going through the session. It's a time saver. One of the things that we want to keep in mind also for these sessions is that we want flexibility in the end. That's a really big thing. If you're editing in a way that ties the hands of your supervisor or your mixer, that will obviously cost time. And you just want to always have things malleable so that when the director or picture editor or whoever's sitting behind you is giving out notes in the middle of a mix, or even on an edit session where they're coming in to review your work, you want to be able to adjust things really quickly on the fly. And so some of the things that I'll be talking about will help with that. Before we dive into this also, I just want to make sure we cover a couple of base layers of vocabulary and some of the things that I'll be mentioning. So there's really just 3 terms worth going over for this. And then if I think of any others along the way, I can mention them. But you'll hear me talk about moving things into pre-dubs. And what I mean by pre-dubs are essentially groups of sounds. So this is effects 1. So this would be considered effects predub 1. This is effects predub 2, and so on and so forth. Each one of these groups that you see here we call a predub. And that goes way back to the earlier days of mixing on analog workflows. And we won't get into that at the moment. But just so you know, that's a predub. And then we have VCAs that control each predub. This is super common workflow in mixing. Essentially what a VCA does is we create a group of all of these tracks here, right? So I've got all of this material edited here. And then when I do automation on the VCA, it controls everything within that predub because it's been set up to do so. We're not going to talk about specifically how these are set up now, but you'll hear me talking about working within VCAs, and that's what I'll be referring to. And then the last thing is just stems, obviously a super common term in audio in general, but our stems are divided up into food groups. Here in this film, I've got things divided up between dialogue, effects, Foley, BGs, and music. And we're just going to be talking about the effects stems, which include sound effects, Foley, and BGs for the purposes of this walkthrough tutorial. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about effects layers. So typically there's sort of like a pretty common structure in how we set up predubs across many different templates for many supervisors. It's everybody has their slight own variance and preference on the way they like to get things done, but more often than not, there's a couple of general rules that apply. I'm just going to pop open these folders here quickly so that we can see everything all at once and navigate through. So starting at the top, the first two effects predubs typically tend to be for hard effects and Foley-like things, which could be anything from, let's see, there's doors, there's cloth movement, grabs, punches, touches, anything that's sort of Foley-like that we edit into a scene, opening and closing of cabinets, sitting down on a bed, if there's like springs that squeak. There's lots of examples of this sort of thing, but that's just to name a few. So these first couple predubs are typically reserved for that sort of like simpler sounds, if you will. Not necessarily simple, but simple hard effects. And then moving down, depending, obviously, I'll say all of this is always content dependent, obviously. So, you know, in this particular movie, this is a Western that I did recently. So we've got horses and carriages and all that kind of stuff broken up into different predubs for efficiency's sake. And we'll talk about that a little later. But these predubs could be used for vehicles. It could be used for gunshots, that sort of thing. More complex layered sounds typically tend to be in sort of your mid predub groups. And then once you move lower, I tend to use these for more design-oriented things. So non-diegetic sounds like drones, whoosh transitions, if there's like mystical powers or anything of that nature, sci-fi. Sometimes these predubs can be used as extensions of the above predubs if there's not quite enough room. And that's something to keep in mind too, is that every show will have the need for a different amount of predubs depending on the content. Something that's a really busy action movie with tons and tons of stuff going on may have many more predubs than this. Or you may have a walk and talk drama that feels pretty simple, and maybe you only need 3 or 4 or 5 predubs, depending on the way that you cut. So just keep that in mind, that this is all designed to be extremely flexible. And that's why I also don't name these particular things. Like I call them FX4 and FX5, because that basically makes it so that I can put any content that I need there at any given time. And I don't always have to stick to it exactly, but the general rule of thumb obviously is to adhere to a set of guidelines and to try to, you know, relatively stick to that so that things are fairly easy to find over the course of the movie. So one thing that I like to do in effects editing also is to do things by frequency group. So I tend to stack my material so that higher frequency stuff occurs up top, and then let's say, you know, right here I've got 5 different layers that were cut by an effects editor for me. So if I were doing this, I would do higher frequencies, mid frequency, and then lower frequencies. And this may even be divided in a way where it's like high, mid, low, and then a higher stereo and a lower stereo. Something to that effect. I like to try to keep my frequency ranges more or less from high to low visually, because it makes sense if I got a bunch of layers of things and something's sounding too bright or crispy, or maybe it's got way too much bass or not enough, then it's really quick and easy for me to see visually, okay, this is definitely the bass layer, this is definitely more treble, this is maybe sounding too mid-rangey and muddy, so I could easily mute that one quickly. Without having to audition every single layer of a sound, I can pretty quickly know where I've cut my stuff and make adjustments on the fly. So keep that in mind. And then also in terms of the elements that we break up, so like I mentioned, here we've got horses being drawn. So this is the wooden horse buggy, the carriage on the back. These are the hooves that were cut. We didn't do the horse feet in Foley on this film. We cut them by hand. So we've got our horse hooves. This is like the wagon. And then we would probably put, if there was horses vocalizing or, whinnying or neighing, then we would put that in this lower predub here. And that may be the case somewhere else over here in the film. Yeah, so in this case over here, we've got the wagon, the horse feet, and then these are more layers of feet, it looks like, so it must have been a bigger scene here. But anyway, so we want to divide up by we want to put like sounds with like sounds, but we also want to split them up in a way that creates flexibility for our mixer. So, for example, let's say we have some gunshots, which I know that we do in Reel 5 down here. This is a super session with all the reels put together. So, let's see. Okay, perfect. So, in this movie, we've got a shootout scene that occurs towards the end of the film, one of the climax scenes. And so, one thing that I like to do is to split my guns sometimes between good guys and bad guys on the actual gun shots, because that allows for really quick perspective mixing. If you're closer to the bad guys, you can make the bad guys louder with just one fader and not have to worry about going into every individual layer down here to see which ones are the good guys and the bad guys. And if you're closer to the good guys, you can do the reverse of that, where you pull the bad guys down and push the good guys up. So that allows for really quick grabbing of those VCAs for your mixer to quickly go good guy, bad guy. The other thing I like to do is separate out the bullet whiz-bys and ricochets and impacts, because then that same thing again, like maybe you start off where you're really close of the bad guy shooting the gun, and so you want that to be the main thing, but then we cut to our hero and you see a bunch of bullet impacts getting closer to him. We want the focus then to be on those bullet impacts to feel dangerous. So it's going to be easy to grab a VCA and turn those up and to pull down on the bad guy who's now in the distance. And again, you don't have to dive into every single little layer of what you've edited within that one gunshot element. And so like in this case, we've got bullet buys and impacts here. This is probably the good guy gunshot right here because he shoots much less. And then there's a bunch of bad guys shooting off different pistols and shotguns. And then down here is non-diegetic added things like whooshes and some bass impacts to lend gravity to some of the shots. And so we break it up that way for fast and flexible mixing. Another couple examples quickly would be on a creature, we might have vocals on one layer, we might have the creature's body movement on a second layer, and then any physical action that the creature does, such as like punching or clawing or falling, maybe on a third layer. And again, that would really allow quick and fast flexibility for your mixer to change the levels on the creature. And the last example would be cars. Cars tend to take up a lot of predubs because they're inherently complex machines with a lot of variables in terms of the sounds they can make. So I would probably layer the car engine on top, maybe the tires, screeches, and road noise beneath that. And then a fourth layer might be for internal car movements, such as like the windows or the doors or the gear shifter, that sort of thing. And then maybe even a fourth layer beyond that would be the wind, if the windows are down, if we're inside or outside the car. Again, you want to have really fast flexibility and break these down into food groups that make sense for your mixers and your supervisors, so that you can really quickly make adjustments. When the director says, I want more wind on that, or I want more tire screeches, then you know the predub that those are all in and you can make something work quickly. The last thing I'll touch on really quickly is just that sometimes the definition of sound effects and backgrounds is debated and can be a little blurry. I would tell you to defer to your mixer and your supervisor on this. If you're the supervisor, then talk to your mixer, and ultimately, like, you may get to make the choice on what counts as a background and what counts as a hard effect. A lot of times, if two characters are, say, standing on the edge of a road and a car goes by from right to left and then maybe another one from left to right, some people may put that in the background and say those cars are in the background of the scene and therefore I'm going to treat them like background elements. Or some people may say, no, that's a hard effect on screen because we watched the car go by. It's not like an imagined off-screen world. It doesn't count as a background. Honestly, I don't have a really strong opinion either way, as long as you're communicating where things are. I think, if it's the sort of thing where you're riding in a car and the car is performing actions in a scene, it makes sense to have those in the effects predubs for me personally. But if it's something where cars are in the background, sometimes I tend to treat those as background elements. And sometimes they may be with effects if other effects editors or the supervisor prefers that they be in the effects predubs. Same thing can go with things like fireplaces and fire pits. I know I worked with one crew one time where all of the lightning during a storm was in the effects, whereas I would normally put those in the BGs. So there's a bunch of examples of this. Just tend to go along with whatever the rest of the crew is doing, or make the decision yourself if you're the supervisor and just say, this is how I would like it cut, and be sure to communicate that clearly to your team and to your mixer. So if they're on the stage and the director wants a change, you can let the mixer know, hey, just so you know, that stuff is actually in the BGs, not in the effects where you may expect it, or vice versa. Next, we're going to quickly talk about Foley layers. So Foley gets broken down into three main food groups. Typically on any movie, you'll have a predub of footsteps. So you'll notice a lot of templates and mixers will call these FS, which just stands for footsteps. It's all the feet for characters in a movie. Then we'll have props, which is anything that the mixers, not the mixers, that the Foley artists have to use physical props for in order to create the sounds that you need for your movie. In this case, the Foley artist, there was a lot of physical interaction between the characters in this Western. So the Foley artist ended up giving me 2 tracks for hands for, grabs and pats and rubs and that sort of thing. So that was really useful actually for me to have this broken out this way, because I could really quickly identify that stuff. And then lastly, your Foley artist is going to do a cloth pass for you, and that's going to be used for either international M&E or for mixing in under ADR if you're replacing production, to help give it a little bit of life and the feeling of movement, which helps to ground your characters in the world. And typically your cloth will only be 1 or 2, maybe 3 tracks wide, depending on what's going on and how detailed they were able to get in their pass. So there is there's 2 schools of thought on how to deal with props. Some people like to keep their props down in its own predub, just like this, grouped with the Foley. And then there are people, I've worked on shows where the supervisors wanted their effects props to be cut up into the effects 1 and 2 predubs. And so let's say like I had cut something in effects that was sort of Foley-like, that maybe Foley also covered, then I would go down here and I would grab some of those elements and I would put them up as layers within the effects predubs. Some mixers and supervisors like to work that way because sometimes it can cut down on time spent when you can ride 1 VCA, especially if lots of things are doubled up, like it's been cut by your effects editor because you had time on the show and then was later delivered by Foley. It makes sense to have 1 VCA to grab. And then other people just decide that they want Foley to be its own thing that they handle independently. In this show, because of the sake of time, I was delivered the Foley a little later in the game and didn't have a ton of time to edit this stuff up into the above predubs. So I left it on as its own, and it worked out fine for me. So just keep that in mind, that your supervisor may ask you to edit Foley up, and it may be advantageous to you if you're going to be the one who's going to supervise or mix. And then lastly, we're going to talk about BGs. So the BGs, like I said, it's often debated whether things are backgrounds or hard effects. And again, defer to your supervisor for that. But there's also 2 schools of thought on how to handle backgrounds. So I'll cover both of those quickly. It's very similar to what I was talking about above, where sometimes we decide to put all of the BG layers for a scene across a couple predubs, no matter what the content is. So you may just stack a bunch of files for a particular scene across 1 or 2, maybe 3 predubs. And then as the scene switches to another location, then you may put all of the sounds together. You may checkerboard them down to the lower predubs. So if all of my stuff for this first scene are in predubs 1 and 2, then I may do predubs 3 and 4 for the next scene. The way that I personally prefer to work, and this again lends itself to flexibility, is I break my backgrounds up into categories. So I always have airs and winds and room tone and that sort of thing, like, leaves and trees, sort of airy elements tend to be in this first predub for me. Anything from like grass rustling to wind to room tone, that all goes here. And then my second layer for me is always animal sounds. So whether that's crickets, distant dogs, birds, owls, whatever you have that an animal makes, I put those here in this second predub. My third predub typically gets reserved for either traffic sounds, like I said, it may be cars in the background, maybe the distant sound of traffic in a city, something to that effect. I would put that here. Depending on what the location of the movie is, I may also use this for Walla. Sometimes Walla I put down here in the fourth one. Also, if I am using the third one for traffic, I'll split Walla off and like crowd movement and that sort of thing into this fourth predub. And if that's the case, I'll typically have a fifth predub as well, where I will put sort of alternate weather sounds or environmental sounds that maybe don't fit into any of the above categories. So things like lightning, things like fire in a scene that don't necessarily make sense to have in the effects. If this is like a background type of fire, like a campfire or a fireplace, I may use this fifth or fourth predub for rain. So that sort of thing. So I can continue to always have my layers split out. And it's, again, really fast for me if a director says, those birds are just really annoying, they're way too loud, can we kill those? I know I can just go straight to BG2, select that layer, and mute it, and it's really fast, and it doesn't take me time of having to dig down and audition, 6 or 7 layers or hunt for the exact right name of the thing that I'm looking for. I can just go, oh, that's these guys in a predub 2, and then we move on, the note's addressed. So again, the whole point of organizing yourself in this way is efficiency, both on the stage and even still in the editorial process. When picture's making a lot of changes and they're throwing a lot of new ideas at you, you need to be able to move quickly and to know where your layers are so that you can make adjustments without having to dig through things. Because the last thing you want to do really is, especially if you're on a time crunch, is your supervisor or a director or a producer asks for a note and you've got 18 layers or 20 layers or however many layers, just all on top of each other without like a whole lot of visual organization. It could take you forever to look for that thing that they either want more of or that they don't want at all. And so the goal here obviously is to just stay on top of it, because it makes you look like a professional to both your superiors and your client. It saves you time. And it also allows you to stay in the creative zone, because you can compartmentalize things in ways that will make it easier. We're like, okay, I can get through all of this section of this one type of sound before you move on to another layer. Because, especially in really complex movies, if it's something like a battle scene or a chase scene, or there's some sci-fi scenario or creature, it can become overwhelming to watch something and to try to think of all the layers that you need at once, and to try to cut all of those things vertically sometimes, where you cut every layer of every action at once, can take a really long time. Whereas if you divide that thing up into subcategories across the length of a scene, you can typically cut those things relatively more quickly, because you're already within the same search parameters on SoundMiner. You're using like sounds, and you already know where those textures are, as opposed to having to always go and look for different types of sounds for every individual layer that you're building. You can spread them out in broader strokes, build them out, in broader strokes. And it just tends to be more efficient that way and keep you in the creative zone. So that's about all I've got. So thank you guys for tuning in very much. I appreciate it. Thank you again to Pro Sound Effects. If you guys have a chance, go subscribe to their YouTube channel and check out their blog. They've got really great material on there for people who are both experienced and brand new. There's sort of a range that is available for everybody to, either brush up on your basics or learn new stuff for the first time. I've got another video on editing shortcuts that may be useful to you, and one on file management, which helps everybody in this time of remote workflows during the pandemic. So again, if you need any help, drop me a line. Subscribe to these guys at Pro Sound Effects, and thanks a bunch.